All right, seventh graders, here we go with the American Revolution. This is input 12 that you will add to your interactive notebook for output 12. The early years of the American Revolution. We had loyalists in the colonies. Some parts of the colonies, 1 in 3 colonists were loyalists. This division caused turmoil in many families that had different views on the conflict. So you had brothers, fathers and sons, daughters and mothers that had opinions that were different, that caused problems at home. Even in Benjamin Franklin's own family, there was a loyalist who thought that they should stay loyal to England instead of fighting for independence. African Americans, if you remember back to the Boston Massacre, Crispus Attucks, an African American, was the first casualty of the American Revolution. The British tried to appeal to slaves, saying they would be free if they fought for the British. Now, the advantages that the Patriots had: colonists were fighting on their home turf and fighting for their homes. The British used mercenaries to fight George Washington. Raising an army. This was very difficult to get soldiers to enlist in the army. The Continental Congress had no power to wage taxes on the colonists and had no money to pay, so a lot of the work that was done by the soldiers was said you will get paid in the end. New York. So the summer of 1776, the British sent 32,000 soldiers to intimidate the colonists into surrender. It did not work. Nathan Hale, he was a teacher, volunteered to spy on the British. When he was found out, he was hanged. And his quote, one of the most famous in American history: "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." So colonists were losing and Washington needed more soldiers. And this, like I said before, was very difficult to get soldiers to fight. So he begged for soldiers and asked Congress to enlist freed slaves. Many white Southerners did not like this idea of giving freed slaves guns. And in 1778, Rhode Island had an all-African American regiment. And here's a recreation on the left, a painting of an African American soldier fighting along a British continental soldier, or colonial continental soldier. And then on the right, we have the Boston Massacre with Crispus Attucks. So the British pushed for victory. They create a three-pronged attack, all leading to an attack on Albany, New York. The British capture Philadelphia in 1777, capital of the colonies at this time. So General Burgoyne, British general that was very vain, traveled with many luxuries through the forests. He would have caravans of wagons and carts that had clothing and jewels and fancy perfumes because he was a fan of those things. So the Green Mountain Boys, remember Nathan Hale, attacked the redcoats that were easy to spot in the woods. And Saratoga, October 17th, 1777, as Yankee Doodle played, 5,700 British soldiers surrendered at Saratoga, New York. So the war continues. This is input 13 in your interactive notebook. Allies start to come to our aid. France, 1778, the French and Americans form an alliance. The French send money, equipment, and troops to the Americans. This is a big deal because the French hate the British and they have money, something that the colonists do not. Spain decided to ally themselves with the Americans because of their negative view of the British. Famous individuals that helped. Marquis de Lafayette. He was a French nobleman that bought a ship and sailed it to Philadelphia to help fight. Friedrich von Steuben, a former German soldier that came to America, and he trained the Continental Army. George Washington knew of his impressive skills as a soldier and as a trainer. Valley Forge, one of the most famous parts of the American Revolution. It is a small valley located 20 miles from Philadelphia. General Washington and his troops camped at Valley Forge for the winter. Many soldiers died there or were deserted from the army. And the army was more confident, though, and resilient after living through the harsh winter of Valley Forge. And if you ever travel to Philadelphia, you can go through Valley Forge and still see many of the structures that were put up by Washington. A lot of them are recreations, but a lot of them still have some originals to it, and you don't even have to Get out of your car, you can see it all as you go. So here's a very famous painting of Washington and his troops in Valley Forge. There were soldiers that had no boots, no jackets, not a lot of food, and winter in the north, as we know, can take a long time. So economics and loyalists. Congress did not have the power to tax, so having money was an issue. Congress printed millions of dollars that became worthless and led to inflation. They made money with no value to it, and that is not a good way to run a country. And loyalists were everywhere in the colonies. No matter where you went, loyalists were there. And this could create some issues. There was some backlash against loyalists. Even though we were fighting for freedom and liberty, people didn't want to let the loyalists have their own opinion. So many of these loyalists fled to Canada, where Canada wasn't fighting against British rule, and Florida, that was ran by the Spanish. African Americans. All men are created equal from the Declaration of Independence. Many former slaves petitioned their colonial governments to ban slavery based on these words and the Christian principles that many of the colonists led their lives by. Unfortunately, it did not happen, and we know this doesn't change until after the Civil War. So, 7th graders, make sure you are completing your input and output. Also, you need to make sure you're reading the text as well. Thank you, and make sure you're doing your homework.